Hello there. Welcome to another episode of Seeing Clearly with Charlotte Giblin, where I share some experiences as an artist and tell stories with universal themes based largely on my book of the same name, hoping to connect with you in some way. I know that the experiences that I have are not unusual, and it can give a great sense of connection and support when you know, I speak from experience, when I discovered that other people felt the same way as I did. It can be relatively lonely as an artist working in isolation, and to be able to reach out is really important. If you haven't discovered these videos before, you will soon find out that I'm all about the long form one-to-one conversation. It's a deliberate antidote to all of the cut and polish of the fast editing, Hollywood and a lot of social media. This is about real life, slowing things down, not rushing so much. I am very guilty of rushing a lot, or in the past having felt like I needed to rush around and do so many things at once. And I found it really helpful to approach all of my courses, my teaching, all of my videos with a much more authentic, for me, conversational tone, where everything is done in real time with no edits, no script, just a conversation or a monologue. Yeah, I've got to get out of the habit of saying conversation because you can't talk back. But if you have any comments about any of the issues that come up in this video or any of my other videos, please do leave a comment and I will get back to you and maybe even create a new video based on what you've suggested or said. Now, this painting here is a really important one in my catalogue and in my personal history. And I want to talk a little bit about the context of the painting, as well as the effect that it had on my career, but also maybe some surprising impact it had, some surprising inner conflict it created for me as an artist. It's not a very flattering picture of myself when I tell you about the inner conflict it created, but it's really important to share those moments, I feel, because it's not all glitz and glamour as an artist when you've created something that other people admire. And we know we go on quite a personal journey with our art practice. Yeah, I hope that these videos create some contemplation and reflection on your own art practice, as they do for me, the motivation behind your painting and your subjects. So the context of this painting. This is my mum, and this was the first ever painted portrait I'd done of someone other than myself. So I've used myself as a subject because it's easy, because I'm right there and no, I don't have anyone else's ego to contend with. But this was done in 2016 to early 2017. And I was visiting my mum in the UK. I live in New Zealand. And this was the last day that we were together before I was flying home to New Zealand. And we always had this ceremony of afternoon tea. Mum is Canadian, but was Canadian. I've got to get into the habit of saying that. She's no longer with us. Mum was Canadian. And but the ceremony of afternoon tea and sitting around and discussing things, important themes of the day, just having really close, comfortable conversation was always very prevalent. And this was our last afternoon tea together, where we would put the world to rights. And I knew that it was going to be really difficult for Mum to say goodbye. There'd been part of her, I think, that was hoping I would want to return to the UK. At that stage, I'd been in New Zealand for 6 or 7 years. And at that stage, I was also questioning whether I wanted to remain. And I think there's part of Mum that was really hoping that I would return, even though she made a considerable journey from Canada to the UK, where she met my dad and continued to live until the end of her life. She understood why I wanted to leave and always felt that my journey had continued hers. But it was an enormous amount of grief and loss for her when I moved away. We were very close and continue to have a close relationship, of course, since I emigrated. But it changed things. And this was a moment which created alarm bells in me. Alarm bells in a sense that I had this voice saying, take a photo, capture this moment, and do some drawings of her hands. And I knew that she was very conscious of the way she looked. And I asked very tentatively, I was nervous about it, saying, could I take some photographs of you? She hated having a photograph taken. I'd really like to do a portrait. And she conceded and said, of course, if it'll help you with your art practice. She was a huge supporter of my art practice, always was. Even though we were very different types of people, she understood the creative drive. She had a lot of creative talents herself. And I am forever grateful that I listened to that internal voice, because I was able to take a whole series of photographs and stitch together bits to create this portrait. And I did drawings of her hands, which were already quite swollen from arthritis at that point. And in fact, that was the last series of photographs I took of Mum. She died 8 years after, but each time her physicality deteriorated considerably when I saw her. And I just didn't want to remember her in that way. So it was a wonderful moment to capture and to show her celebration of the tea ceremony and the details that she used to really, really enjoy, matching a napkin to her outfit or to the teacup, whichever way round it was. Now, stepping aside from the moment I took the painting, the reason why I decided to do this painting, maybe somewhat cynically, but very honestly, was a discovery that I'd made from the decades of visiting art galleries and seeing what people were drawn to as buyers, but also thinking about the response that the public had to many different types of artwork. My painting style has always been much more energetic, let's put it that way. Bright, colourful, maybe a bit in your face. I have always tried to describe the energy that I feel inside and connect with other people through those painted stories on canvas. And I found, and this was a real ego bruise over years, that actually the reaction to a lot of my slightly wacky, colourful artwork was a bit of repellent to people. They would find it a bit too much. And I thought to myself, okay, all right, I know what I can do, which will unify everybody in my studio, in my exhibitions. I'll do a sad portrait of my dear old mum, who is clearly frail and suffering in some way. And I was conflicted to discover that I was absolutely correct. Not only has this become one of my most favoured and discussed paintings, it also, I was proved right, but I didn't want to be proved right, because what it showed me, or what I felt at the time, I mean, there's a really good chance that all of the paintings I did around that period were just rubbish. Nobody wanted to buy them. Although a series I did shortly after this of forest pathways and brightly coloured trees did actually end up being commercially successful. But at the time when I produced this, I was displaying it in an open studio I had up in the Coromandel in New Zealand here. And all around my studio, I had these really bright, energetic forests all about joy and choosing light and the brightness of positivity. And people were going around the studio a bit like that. Oh, God, it's all a bit much. And there was me at the side of the door, jazz hands and being all excited about life. And it was like everybody was so exhausted by me and put off by this exuberance, like it was forced. And maybe to a degree at the time it was. But what happened was that people came round to the front of the studio where I had this painting. And it was like this sigh of relief, like, oh, thank goodness we have this image to connect with. And it created the most fantastic series of conversations about my mum, about the relationship with my mum, about emigration. So many people shared their own stories. It brought tears to the eyes of many people. And I thought afterwards, and I continue to think to a certain extent, like, why is that? Why are we unified by a sense of sadness, of loss, of regret? Is it because the human condition automatically comes with that we know there's going to be loss and pain and grief? And why is it that that's easier to accept and embrace than to look at joy and happiness? It's almost like we regard that as fleeting, or you can't have things too good for too long because then you're out of happiness and joy. That's been an issue for me my whole life. I was very much my mum's emotional caretaker. She suffered from anorexia. It might be obvious there. And although for most of her life, she ate a lot, but very small amount. I mean, she ate lots of meals. She ate a lot during the day, but really small amounts of food, and definitely not enough protein. So when she died, I think the cause of death was put down as frailty. I mean, she wasn't able to rebuild muscle and became incredibly thin. But wow, I mean, tough as nails to have survived until she was 77 when she died. But for anybody who knows about anorexia, it has nothing to do with trying to lose weight to make yourself attractive. It's as far as my experience of it, watching mum, and my understanding of it through those discussions and a little bit of further research, it's about control, and I think to a certain degree denying yourself pleasure, which was absolutely the case for my mum. And her anorexia was triggered when she was 11 or 12, but there needs to be a certain type of mindset in place, a certain chemistry, I think, for the condition, the disease to be triggered. And she struggled with, I suppose if she'd been diagnosed, because she was incredibly smart and wouldn't have a bar of any of the psychologists and doctors wanting to diagnose her. Maybe she was bipolar, very much up and down, but also at real extremes, sort of explosive anger, meltdowns, and then controlling it, and the regret and the self-flagellation. I mean, not literally, but the punishment for the way she behaved. And it manifests then in a really tight sense of control and trying to control things. And for whatever reasons you believe, I was the right person to be her daughter, because I was able to, at a very young age, discover have an understanding and an empathy for people who didn't operate or think in the same way that I did, and have a non-judgmental compassion, which I'm really grateful for. It was tough as anything at the time and growing up. I went into protection mode for mum, and I spent most of my life trying to unpick a lot of that sense of responsibility for other people, saving other people from themselves, trying to protect people from the difficulties of life, because I didn't feel that at the outset. I was imbued with this gift that I didn't ask for. I call it, in the book, I talk about it as my wellspring. It's like this source of energy and positivity, which there was nothing I could do about. And any time that things felt just way too difficult, and a lot of things felt way too difficult, I knew that if I went for a walk, or if I just sort of tapped into this inner light gush of energy, I would be okay. And I was always able to default back to my original setting of happiness very, very quickly. And it didn't take long to look around and discover that not many other people seemed to have that. And it sent me on a path in which I buried that, and because I didn't want to be too weird. And people didn't trust me because I was happy. They thought it was fake. They thought I was putting it on, and which is the same thing as fake, isn't it? And I mean, for many, many years, people would ask me if I was on drugs because I was happy. And no, I have never been on drugs. But what an awful thing to realize about society, that it's assumed, the default is assumed to be negative and difficult. And we all have our own levels of negative and difficult. And I had a number of different layers of self, and one of them became filled with anxiety and fear and anxiousness about trying to make sure everybody else was okay. And it completely took over the happy version of myself. And I managed to manifest all kinds of dreadful things in my life because I believed that I had to, because I saw around me that most people's experience was like this. And the connecting factor with other people has been invaluable, but it also brought up so many questions about what we expect from our experience of life that I find this quite a challenge. And it's almost like I have removed myself completely from having painted it. And on that note, when I was working on this painting, I was teaching drawing classes, and all of my drawing classes and my subsequent painting classes have been about realism, about seeing things as they really are, not what you think they are, not what you think you're seeing. And I did this there's a duality to it, actually. Partly the cup and the ellipses, which are really challenging to draw for a lot of people. I found them very challenging as well. Partly as a technical example of how to create a realistic looking china mug. And I always include hands in my portraits. just because there's this idea that hands are really difficult to paint, which they're not really any more difficult than any other part of the human form. But I include them to show as an example for my students in particular at the time how to go about doing it, as well as the challenge for myself. As I said, this was the first time I'd painted anybody else other than myself. So it was a really different colour palette, a very different feeling that I was trying to get across. And also celebrating the ceremony of tea and putting the world to rights over a cup of coffee or a glass of wine or whatever it is that you use to link with other people and to talk about things and to share. And in fact, my art business was originally pottery. That's what I studied as a degree, and I had a pottery business for 10 years. And the whole point of the pottery, and I did really happy, cheerful, simple cartoons of animals on the exterior of all my mugs and bowls and plates. It was about connection. It was my way of infiltrating people's lives just a little bit with a tiny bit of my positivity and joy, surreptitiously, without anybody being repelled by it. And that was the most important aspect of the business for me, actually. So all of my portraits include cups, because I've done portraits of a number of women where they have been, it's been about that connection with, I wanted to celebrate the connection and the discussions with the person in the portrait. So it's partly for technical example, partly to tell a story, partly for me to practice, partly to connect with the viewer. But this is the only painting that I've ever done which couldn't be less about me and has been one of the most popular pieces I've ever done. And as I alluded to earlier, it created for a while the most devastating period of ego destruction, because I was sent on a spiral of self-doubt and questioning why I was trying to create anything at all, why I was trying to put myself on a canvas and tell my own story when people weren't interested in my story or my energy at all. What they were interested in was the connection to their own sense of loss or regret or some kind of story which felt accessible and relatable to them. And the happy, happy, joy, joy wasn't doing it. And so it's really, it's such a, even talking about it, and I've talked about this painting so many times and tried to explain to people how it creates this conflict within me and be really honest about how much it damaged my ego, which makes it sound like I didn't even do it. And most people say, but oh my goodness, you've captured the essence of this, of your mother, and it tells so much about your relationship with her. And I appreciate that. I really do. And I look at it now, I still, this is the original, I still own the original, which I'm very pleased about, actually. And I have her hanging up on my studio wall, and I see it every day, see the painting every day and say hello to Mum. And I'm really pleased that I've got it. And there are times when I look at it and appreciate it as a technical work. But it really did create so many layers of questioning for me about the human experience and what we share with other people and what we expect. And me knowing that it was going to connect with people just shows how prevalent our understanding of sadness and loss and regret is. And yes, it's part of the human experience, but it's not all of it. And I've had to battle my whole life to allow myself to let out that more natural sense of joy when I come from this background. And I wonder how you're feeling about this discussion, this conversation, these thoughts in relation to the painting. Because I do know people who have just rolled their eyes at me and said, like, what is the problem? Like, you've made this beautiful painting of your mum who is no longer around. Just celebrate that. But I think as artists, we have this sense of questioning, and we do look at the world in a different way. And I don't make apologies for that. And I think it really does bring up a lot of interesting questions about the kind of portraiture that we see in galleries, the different styles of portraiture, the way that men are presented, the way that women are presented, and what we connect with. I haven't once stood in front of this painting and cried. I think because there are so many layers of complexity in any relationship that we have with our mothers or anybody in the family. But it has brought other people to tears. And if it does that in a positive way to perhaps encourage people in real time to then reach out and make a connection because of this sense of impending loss and grief, then I see that as really positive, and then my job has been done from the Charlotte aspect as opposed to the artist daughter aspect. And they are all interwoven, of course. And she suffered a lot. She really did suffer. She found life difficult, and that was very painful to see. And I know anybody who has somebody suffering from anorexia in their family or a friend will understand the difficulty in watching somebody do this to themselves. It's very, very hard to prevent it. But it has spoken to a lot of people, and I'm grateful for that, because I do want to connect with all my work, even if it says very little about me. Well, there we go. A lot of contemplative, reflective pause for thought today. And I'll look forward to seeing you in the next one. Thank you so much.